Good day. For today, I'm going to talk about pathology of renal diseases. Renal diseases are basically responsible for a great number of morbidity and mortality. It is considered as that acute kidney injury occurs in more than 2 million people worldwide. It is actually a major risk factor for the development of chronic kidney disease and end-stage renal disease. When you talk of renal diseases, this is the topic outline. We're going to talk about first the clinical manifestations, the different glomerular diseases, and then the tubular and interstitial diseases, diseases of blood vessels, congenital and developmental anomalies, cystic diseases of the kidney, urinary tract obstruction, stones, and tumors of the kidney. To start with, it is customary for the diseases of the kidney to be divided into four basic morphologic components. As it is written, the first would be diseases of the glomerulus, followed by the tubules, interstitium, and blood vessels. This approach is useful because the early manifestations of disease affecting each of these components tends to be distinct. So I am trying to present right now the normal morphology of the kidney. It is a bilateral retroperitoneal organ. You have the cortex and of course the medulla. Normally, each of the kidney weighs around 150 grams. It converts more than 1,700 liters of blood per day into about 1 liter of urine. It is responsible for the excretion of waste products of metabolism, regulation of concentration of water and salt, and it also maintains acid-base balance. It serves to secrete certain hormones, like for example, erythropoietin, renin, and prostaglandin. It also serves to regulate vitamin D metabolism. So when you look at the kidney, this is actually how the urine is formed. It goes through process called filtration, and then you have tubular reabsorption, tubular secretion, and then excretion. Stating it simply, whatever you need needs to go back, and the process is called reabsorption, goes back into your system. And whatever you don't need is supposedly excreted. Now, in renal diseases, for example, the nitrogenous waste products of metabolism, which is exemplified by BUN and creatinine levels, are supposed to be excreted so that when renal function fails, the excretion function is diminished. Thereby, these levels are expected to go up. So when you're trying to diagnose renal diseases, an increase in BUN creatinine level is an example of a test that would prove to be that you are having renal function abnormalities. Now, when we talk of renal function abnormalities, some terms that you need to remember. I was talking about BUN and creatinine level a while ago. When this is elevated, the term is called azotemia. It is usually accompanied by a decreased glomerular filtration rate. Azotemia can be caused by a renal problem. It can also be pre-renal, which is, for example, when there is hypoperfusion of the kidneys impairing the renal function, such as in patients having hypotension, excessive fluid losses, or if the effective intravascular volume is decreased, like in patients with shock or volume depletion or congestive heart failure. It can also be post-renal azotemia. Whenever there is flow in the obstruction, as in patients with stones or tumor, then this is an example of post-renal azotemia. So again, simply stated, azotemia implies an elevation in the BUN and creatinine level. It may be renal, pre-renal, or post-renal. Now, when the symptoms of azotemia leads to clinical signs and symptoms associated with biochemical abnormalities, the term is now called uremia. Uremia is characterized by failure of renal excretory function and accompanied by metabolic and endocrine alterations that results in renal damage. They usually manifest with secondary involvement of other organs, like for example, the gastrointestinal tract, the peripheral nerves, and the heart. So you'll have gastroenteritis, neuropathy, or pericarditis. When you say that your patient is having nephritic syndrome, these are the things that should be present. You'll have hematuria, which is red cells in the urine that is evident when you do the urinalysis. You're expecting diminished GFR. The protein level can be quantified. And if it exceeds more than 3.5 grams per day, then that is more of a nephrotic rather than a nephritic syndrome. Take note of the role of albumin. Albumin is, if you will recall in the chapter of fluids and hemodynamics, it is very important in its role in the regulation of osmotic pressure. If you decrease albumin, you are expecting the oncotic pressure to be affected so that in renal diseases, the excessive loss would lead to manifestation of edema in your patient. In such cases, the liver tries to compensate so that usually you'll have hyperlipidemia. However, in these cases, it is also observable that it leaks out in the urine, and that is what we call as lipiduria. Sometimes your patient will be asymptomatic hematuria or proteinuria. This is usually reflective of subtle glomerular problems. When you say AKI, what is very important is you note the volume of the urine. AKI is previously called as acute renal failure. The rapid decline in GFR within hours to days, and there is dysregulation of your fluid and electrolytes, retention of metabolic waste products. And as I have mentioned, you have to measure the amount or the volume of urine produced in which it may be decreased or eventually absent. This is characteristic of AKI. When you say chronic kidney disease, in here, we're talking about chronic renal failure, diminished GFR persistently less than 60 ml per minute, or persistent albuminuria are the diagnostic criteria for the diagnosis of chronic kidney disease. ESRD is when the GFR is less than 5%. This is regarded as the terminal stage of uremia. For renal tubular defects, excessive urine formation, urination at night, electrolyte disorders in the form of metabolic acidosis are usually what you would see in your patient. Obstruction, as I have mentioned, may be in the form of stone, or it may also be in the form of tumors. When you're talking of UTI, it is important to do urinalysis coupled with culture and sensitivity. This will enable you to identify the type of organism and hopefully lead to the treatment of the patient, when you have given the right antibiotic. Nephrolithiasis, as I have said, is usually characteristically manifesting with spasm of severe pain. This is called as renal colic. It is often accompanied by hematuria. So again, that's the rundown of the different clinical manifestation that you will encounter as we go along the chapter. So, how to diagnose renal disease? If you are listening, as I have mentioned, there are tests that you can do. One of the most common would be, again, a blood level assay of your BUN and creatinine. Secondly, the sample would be your urine. It may be in the form of urinalysis, a 24-hour urine monitoring, so that you may be able to calculate the glomerular filtration rate. It can also be that you employ radiographic studies. This will enable you to visualize the presence of tumors or stones. Take note of some of the important terms, like for example, when you say azotemia, it means that the BUN creatinine level is going up. If it worsens further, then from azotemia, you enter the phase of uremia. Do not forget the difference between your nephrotic and your nephritic type. And so another thing that can be done to diagnose the disease would then be a biopsy. This is an example of a renal biopsy in which you again observe 4 parameters, as I have stated a while ago. Check the glomerulus, look at the tubules, the interstitium, and of course, the blood vessels. So as you go through this, the glomerulus, tubules, interstitium, and blood vessels, that would lead you to diagnose what is the disease of your patient, depending on the histologic characteristics that are observed. Let us try to review the structure of the glomerulus. The glomerulus is basically a tuft of capillaries. So if you're going to look at this illustration, this is showing you the nephron. So again, to start with, the glomerulus is composed of a tuft of capillaries. From this illustration, it is manifested by these orange structures, which lines the capillary wall. The orange structures are corresponding to what we call as the endothelium. The endothelial cells are around 70 to 100 nanometer in diameter. Now, they rest on what you call as glomerular basement membrane. So this is the glomerular basement membrane. The GBM is a layer in which you have what you call as the lamina densa and the lamina rara interna or externa. The GBM is consisting mostly of collagen, particularly type 4, laminin, polyanionic proteoglycans, usually heparan sulfate, fibronectin, entactin, and other glycoproteins. So take note. Again, you have the endothelial cells lining the glomerular capillary walls. Next to it would be your glomerular basement membrane, which is consisting mostly of collagen type 4. Now, next to which, you will see what you call as the foot process. This is otherwise known as the epithelial cells or podocytes. So again, endothelial cells, glomerular basement membrane, foot process, or epithelial cells, or podocytes. They are embedded and adherent to the lamina rara externa of the basement membrane. There should be adjacent foot processes separated approximately 20 to 30 nanometer from each other. And this is what you call as filtration slits. So do not forget, you have the endothelial side, glomerular basement membrane, and the epithelial site. This green structure is what supports the entire glomerular tuft, and this is what you call as the mesangium. The mesangium lies, as you can see, between the capillaries, and it is composed of basement-like mesangial matrix, forming the meshwork. These are examples of mesangial cells. Mesangial cells are regarded as mesenchymal in origin. They can be contractile, phagocytic, they are capable of proliferation, and they lay down both matrix and collagen. So, let's try to recall. Again, capillaries lined by endothelial cells. Next to it would be your glomerular basement membrane, consists mostly of collagen, particularly type 4. Then you have the epithelial side or your podocytes. It is also where you will see your food process. So the visceral epithelial cells, so this one, is very important in the maintenance of glomerular barrier function. Its diaphragm presents as a size-selective distal diffusion barrier to the filtration of proteins. And this cell type is largely responsible for the synthesis of GBM components. So, I am trying to reiterate this because later, when we go into the diseases of the glomerulus, you would see that immune complexes are deposited in each of these structures. So let's try to recall once again. This is the endothelial side. The blue one is your epithelial side. You have actually two types, the visceral and the parietal epithelium. In between the visceral and parietal is your Bowman's. The green, again, is your mesangium. You have there your mesangial cells. Do not forget that capillaries are lined by endothelial cells, next to which will be your glomerular basement membrane. Okay, let's try to proceed here. If you will open your book, the renal diseases there are classified into the following groups: cystic, glomerular, tubular and interstitial, vascular, urinary tract obstruction, urolithiasis or stones, and tumors. When we talk of glomerular diseases, so this is again another illustration of your nephron, this time an electron microscopic view. So if we say glomerular filter, we are referring to, again, the following structures: the endothelium, the basement membrane, the epithelial side, in which you have the filtration slits. You have two types, the visceral and the parietal epithelial cells. So let's take a look at it here again. Podocytes are otherwise known as food process. This is an illustration of a normal glomerulus. So just to remind you that it is important that you have an idea of the normal so that when complexes are deposited, you can have a easier time distinguishing the deposition of the immune complexes, which is almost always characteristic of all glomerular diseases. So, I have already described a while ago the different syndromes, and it is likewise enumerated here again. Now, let us go to different glomerular diseases. So as a pathologist, if you are looking at a renal biopsy and you think that the problem is the glomerulus, then you have to look for the following characteristics. Number one is Is your glomerulus exhibiting increased cellularity? There are a number of inflammatory diseases of the glomerulus in which it tends to increase the number of cells in the glomerular tuft. So, if you will recall the illustration that I was trying to explain a while ago, the hypercellularity can then result from proliferation of mesangial cells, endothelial cells, and even epithelial cells. When it is epithelial cells, it may lead to formation of crescents. Crescents are expected to be formed when you have proliferation of epithelial cells. I will show you typical examples later. So for now, bear in mind that when you say hypercellularity, it may take the form of proliferation of mesangial cells, endothelial cells, or epithelial cells. For the epithelial cells, once they are the ones proliferating, it leads to formation of crescents. In addition, as it is written here, it may also be that the hypercellularity is secondary to infiltration of WBC, like neutrophils, monocytes, and even lymphocytes. The inflammatory cells, the swelling and the proliferation of the mesangial cells, which may be accompanied by endothelial cell proliferation, will then be responsible for your glomerular hypercellularity. When you say basement membrane thickening, so I hope you still recall the illustration. Endothelial side, that's the glomerular capillary tuft. Next to it would be your basement membrane, which, as I have said, is predominantly composed of collagen, particularly type 4. The change in the thickening of the capillary walls is best seen by employing special stains, like, for example, periodic acid Schiff. It is also best visualized by electron microscopy rather than light microscopy. So as I have said, again, basement membrane, that's the structure between your endothelial cells and your epithelial cells. How would you know that it is thickened, or why is it becoming thick? I have mentioned a while ago that most glomerular diseases results from deposition of immune complexes. And these immune complexes appears as amorphous electron-dense material that is very easily seen utilizing electron microscopy. It may also be that there is increased synthesis of protein components, formation of additional layers of basement membrane matrices, which often occupy subendothelial locations, may range from poorly organized matrix to fully duplicated lamina densa, as in patients with membranoproliferative glomerulonephritis. I'll show you that a little later. So do not forget hypercellularity, both basement membrane thickening, and then hyalinosis and sclerosis. When you say hyalinosis, it is denoting accumulation of material that is appearing as homogeneous and eosinophilic by light microscopy. Hyalin is an extracellular amorphous material composed of plasma proteins. When extensive, these deposits may obliterate the capillary lumen of the glomerular tuft. Hyalinosis is usually a consequence of endothelial or capillary wall injury, and typically the end result of various forms of glomerular damage. The last is what we call as sclerosis. When you say sclerosis, the C there should remind you of collagenous matrix. It may be confined to the mesangium. It may also be that the sclerosing process may result in obliteration of the capillary lumens of the affected glomeruli. So, do not forget, okay, some key points. What are the pathologic responses of glomerulus to injury? Number one, as I have mentioned, would be hypercellularity, basement membrane thickening. Number two, hyalinosis and sclerosis. These are the terms that you should bear in mind. Now, when we're talking of glomerulus, so you're focused now on the glomerulus. You have observed either of the four changes again, hypercellularity, basement membrane thickening, hyalinosis, and sclerosis. The next thing is scan the slide. The tissue specimen, assess the glomerular involvement. There are terms that you should be familiar with, like for example, does it involve all the glomeruli in the renal biopsy? If so, then that is what you call as diffuse. Does it involve the entirety of individual glomeruli? Then that is what you call as global. Or is it only involving a fraction of the glomeruli in the kidney? That is what you call as focal. Or is it only affecting a part of each glomerulus? That's what you call as segmental. Or does it affect predominantly capillary or mesangial regions? So that's the last bullet, capillary loop or mesangial. So again, observe the four changes: hypercellularity, basement membrane thickening, hyalinosis, and sclerosis. Once you see that, look at the pattern. Is it diffuse? Is it global? Is it focal? Is it segmental? Is it capillary loop or mesangial? If you're going to look at this is a quick eye view or bird's eye view of what we have to study moving forward. I've been mentioning about electron microscopy and light microscopy. So I would like to add now one more, and that is what you call as fluorescence microscopy. From the term itself, it employs dye, which emits colors, like for example, green. It also gives you two patterns. As you can see here, it's either granular or linear. The take-up of the dye is dependent on what is the antibody that you are trying to demonstrate. If you are following, as I have said, most glomerular injury arises from antigen-antibody complexes deposition. So as you can see here, we have markers that are employed, and you are expecting either a granular or a linear pattern. Now, if you're going to look at the second column, there comes again the terms nephritic or nephrotic. That's why early on, I was emphasizing that when you see hematuria, hypertension, these are more of nephritic type. Proteinuria is expected in both, but when it is of massive amounts, then that is more of the nephrotic. As we go along, you will also realize that sometimes there's an overlap of both nephritic and nephrotic occurring in the same patient. So to diagnose the disease, aside from the lab workups of blood, like BU and CREA, the urine sample, as I have said, you need to do a biopsy. The biopsy will be stained by H&E, and that is what you call as light microscopy. The same tissue sample can be subjected to electron and fluorescence microscopy for you to be able to distinguish further the location. As you can see here, subepithelial, subendothelial, the location of the deposits, and it will also give you the pattern of either granular or linear. I will explain that as we move along. So there are different immune mechanisms of glomerular injury. It may be antibody mediated. It may be in situ immune complex deposition, like fixed intrinsic antigens, as in under which would be your anti-GBM nephritis, membranous glomerulonephritis, or is it something that is formed in the circulation, and that is what you call as planted antigen. You also have your circulating immune complexes, which may be endogenous antigens like tumor, or exogenous antigens like infectious products. It may also be cell-mediated and activation of complement pathway. So let us take a look at each one. So immune complex deposition can be intrinsic or in situ antigen. In this form of injury, immune complexes are formed locally by antibodies that react with intrinsic tissue antigens or with extrinsic antigens planted in the glomerulus from the circulation. One classic example here is membranous nephropathy. So when you say injury by antibodies reacting in situ within the glomerulus, they are either binding to insoluble fixed intrinsic glomerular antigen, like for example, type 4 collagen, or extrinsic molecules planted within the glomerulus, like for example, immune complexes. The pattern of immune deposition, as I have said a while ago, can be visualized as either granular or linear. Usually, if it is an in situ formation of immune complexes, the pattern observed on immunofluorescence would be granular, which reflects the localized antigen-antibody interaction. This is usually visualized or supported by doing electron microscopy, and the location is often subepithelial electron-dense deposit. So again, in situ, it will usually give you granular pattern, and often it is evidenced as subepithelial electron-dense deposits on EM. And this is typified by what we call as membranous nephropathy. Now, on the other hand, antibodies can also react in situ with antigens that are not normally present in the glomerulus, but are planted there. These are examples of planted antigens that binds to anionic components of the glomerulus, under which you have DNA, nucleosomes, nuclear proteins, bacterial products, immunoglobulins. They may deposit in the mesangium, and immune complexes themselves may be visualized again by electron microscopy. Now, this is just an illustration again of what I am trying to explain. So, the immune complexes may be circulating, or the antibodies are formed as a reaction to intrinsic antigens that are already present in your GBM. For example, let's take a look at this. In anti-GBM antibody-induced glomerulonephritis, the antibodies, as you can see, are lining up here. They are binding to intrinsic antigens distributed along the length of your GBM. Again, the antibodies are binding on the antigens that are expected to be components of your GBM, so that when you observe it under fluorescence microscopy, it would emit a diffuse linear pattern. Now, if you're going to look at this, another example, in here, when they are filtered, so as you can see, these are antibodies reacting against a component of your GBM. Here, when they passes through your capillaries for filtration, they are already formed. The antigen-antibody complexes are already formed. So, as they passes through your capillary tuft, they tend to be trapped. And this antigen-antibody complexes tends to be deposited in the subendothelial layer. Subendothelial layer. So, this is another example. In here, you have here the immune complexes, this time in the subepithelial layer. So, if you're following my discussion, I have given you 3 locations: subendothelial, along the GBM, and subepithelial. It may be reacting in the components that are in your glomerular tuft, or it may be already formed at the time that it is filtered in your kidneys. So, let us try to take a look at this. So, when you study glomerular diseases, as I have said, first you do light microscopy. Second, you do fluorescence microscopy. You're expecting 2 patterns, either granular or linear. And then you do EM, or electron microscopy, which would give you the different locations. So let's try to study this. So as you can see here, the immune complex is right there. So that is what we regard as subepithelial. And it is characteristic of acute glomerulonephritis. On the other hand, it may also be that they are depositing in the mesangium. These black ones are the immune complexes, and that is characteristic of IgA nephropathy. As you can see here, they are underneath the endothelium. So that is what we call as subendothelial, which may be seen in lupus nephritis and MPGN. Or they may be seen along the glomerular basement membrane, and these are examples of glomerulonephritis. So, 4 locations. Is it subepithelial? Is it along the GBM? Is it subendothelial? Or is it mesangial? We have here an illustration of mediators, including cells. So, as I have mentioned, it can be antibody deposition or cell-mediated. The neutrophils and monocytes usually infiltrate the glomeruli in most glomerulonephritis. It is usually leading to activation or generation of chemotactic agents, particularly C5a. C5a. Neutrophils can also release proteases, which can destroy. Okay? It can also release proteases, which can cause GBM degradation, oxygen-derived free radicals causing cell damage, and arachidonic acid metabolites, which contributes to reduction in your GFR. You also have the macrophages and T lymphocytes. These are infiltrating the glomeruli in antibody and cell-mediated reaction. When activated, will also release a variety of biologically active molecules. The platelets may aggregate in the glomerulus, and these release eicosanoids, growth factors, and other mediators, which may again further compromise vascular injury and proliferation of glomerular cells. You have resident glomerular cells, particularly what we call as mesangial cells. They can also be stimulated to produce inflammatory mediators, including reactive oxygen species, cytokines, and chemokines. By complement activation, you are expecting that it will lead to the formation of C5b to C9. If you will recall, this is what we call as the membrane attack complex. Whenever you form the membrane attack complex, it is expected that the endpoint of which will be cell lysis. So cell lysis, in addition, may stimulate mesangial cells to produce oxidants, proteases, and other mediators, thereby leading again to injury. So, if we're talking of cytokines, of particular interest would be your interleukin-1 and tumor necrosis factor. Chemokines, on the other hand, do not forget your monocyte chemoattractant protein 1, which promotes monocytes and lymphocyte influx. Growth factors, particularly, is PDGF, which is involved in mesangial cell proliferation, transforming growth factor beta, connective tissue growth factor, and fibroblast growth factors are all seemingly critical in the ECM deposition and hyalinization. So let us move. This is an example of an illustration showing you epithelial injury. So we have here again your podocytes. So let's try to review again. So as I have mentioned, that's your endothelial side. This is your glomerular basement membrane. That is your epithelial side in which you have the podocytes. The postulated sequence is that antibodies specific to epithelial cell antigens, toxins, cytokines, causes cell injury. So when this happens, as you can see here, it tends to be flat or effaced. The effacement may lead to detachment of your epithelial cells, thereby eventually leading to protein leakage, which you will see in the urine of your patient. So, as I have mentioned a while ago, when you're looking at patients with renal problem, it is important to assay or do your urinalysis, quantitate the amount of protein that is leaking out, because it may differentiate whether you're looking at a nephritic or a nephrotic type. Let us go back to the patterns. Right now, we are showing you the image of two patterns that I have been mentioning. The first one here is what you call as granular pattern. And the other one here is what you call as linear pattern. The granular pattern is characteristic of circulating and in situ complex nephritis, and the linear pattern is characteristic of or classic anti-glomerular basement membrane disease. So do not forget two patterns on EM, granular, linear. Okay. Now, let us try to apply the concepts by going into the different diseases. So the first disease that was discussed in your book is called APGN. This is otherwise known as post-streptococcal or post-infectious glomerulonephritis. This is often of the nephritic type. So let's try to recall. When we say nephritic, we're looking for hematuria, hypertension, azotemia, and proteinuria. So do not forget hematuria, hypertension, proteinuria, azotemia. We're looking for patients that are often with history of streptococcal infection of the pharynx or the skin. So they are usually children of 6 to 10 years of age. If you're going to look at the term, it is called proliferative because you're expecting diffuse proliferation of glomerular cells plus influx of leukocytes. Thereby, hypercellularity is expected. The inciting antigen may be exogenous or endogenous. The prototypic exogenous antigen-induced disease pattern is post-infectious glomerulonephritis. An example of endogenous antigen-induced disease is nephritis of SLE. The most common cause would be your streptococci. The most common underlying infection would be streptococcal. Post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis usually appears as a disorder following 1 to 4 weeks after infection of the pharynx or the skin. In the skin, it is somewhat what we call as impetigo. So post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis, as I have mentioned, is more of nephritic. So do not forget hematuria, hypertension, azotemia, proteinuria. Age group is 6 to 10 years old. Now, so what do you expect? It is caused by immune complexes containing streptococcal antigens and specific antibodies. Only certain strains of group A beta hemolytic strep are nephritogennic. More than 90% can be traced to types 12, 4, and 1, which can be identified by typing the M protein of the bacterial cell wall in the laboratory. So to diagnose, you can identify the organism. You can also have titers of antibody determination. The titers of antibody is of course directed against the streptococcal antigen. If you assay the serum complement, it is expected to be low. This is compatible with activation of the complement system and consumption of complement components. So, as I have mentioned, you are expecting that the glomeruli is hypercellular. As you can see here, characteristically, the histologic feature would be enlarged hypercellular glomerulus. Why? As I have mentioned, There is infiltration of leukocytes. There is proliferation of endothelial and mesangial cells. And in severe cases, even epithelial cells, which leads to crescent formation. The proliferation and leukocyte infiltration are typically global and diffuse. Again, it is typically global and diffuse. The streptococcal antigenic component responsible for the immune reaction is what we call as exotoxin B. This is the principal antigenic determinant in most cases of post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. Now, this protein can directly activate the component so that when you look at it under immunofluorescent stain, they are expected to have coarsely granular deposits of complement protein C3. And when you look at it under electron microscopy, characteristically, they will be depositing as hump-like deposits, subepithelial side. It may also be subendothelial or intramembranous deposits of complexes. You must understand that this is called as post-infectious because though the most common is streptococci, others may also cause this type of morphology. Like for example, it may also be Staphylococcus, Meningococcus. It may also be viral agents like hepatitis, mumps, HIV, varicella. It can either be parasitic like malaria or toxoplasmosis. So that is why the other term for this disease is also post-infectious. So let's take a look at this electron microscopic image. These are examples of discrete electron-dense deposits on the epithelial side of the membrane. They are often referred to as humps. Presumably, again, they represent the antigen-antibody complexes at the subepithelial side. But take note that subendothelial and intramembranous may also be present. So that's the first case, which is APGN. Now, let's go to the second one, and this is what we call as rapidly progressive, otherwise known as crescentic glomerulonephritis. Characteristically, it will connote severe glomerular injury. It is characteristically rapid. There is progressive loss of renal function. Oliguria to anuria are expected. It is called crescentic because that is the most common histologic feature that you will see. If you will recall what I was saying a while ago, you have the endothelial side, the glomerular basement membrane, and the epithelial side, which are of two types, the visceral and the parietal. When the epithelial side is the one proliferating, it tends to form crescent-like cells. And this encroaches the Bowman space. That is the reason why it is called crescentic. The proliferation of the epithelial cells lining the Bowman capsule and infiltration of monocytes and macrophages is the reason why it is otherwise known as crescentic glomerulonephritis. There are many causes. It may be due to any of the following. The first one, as it is written here, is anti-GBM antibody-mediated disease. This is characterized by linear deposits of IgG and in many cases C3 in the GBM. So the anti-GBM antibodies cross-reacts with pulmonary alveolar basement membrane so that you are actually looking for lesions in two organs. In the kidney, it is rapidly progressive crescentic glomerulonephritis, while in the lungs, you're expecting pulmonary hemorrhage. So do not forget that you look for two lesions. One, RPGN in the kidney. Two, in the lungs. The manifestation would be in the form of pulmonary hemorrhage. Why is this happening? The antigen common to the alveoli in the lungs and the glomerular basement membrane is a peptide within the non-collagenous portion of the alpha-3 chain of collagen type 4. This triggers the formation of autoantibodies so that, again, you are expecting that these autoantibodies will cause RPGN for the kidney and pulmonary hemorrhage. So that's the first group of diseases. It may also be disease caused by immune complex deposition. And this time, characteristically, it would appear as granular deposits of antibodies and complement when you look at it under fluorescent microscopy. It may include your lupus, IgA nephropathy, Henoch-Schönlein purpura. And the third group will be your posi-immune, which is defined as you do not demonstrate anti-GBM antibodies and you do not demonstrate anti-GBM antibodies or immune complexes by immunofluorescence and electron microscopy. So take note of the three types. You have type 1, type 2, and type 3.